Hello, today we're going to talk about the evaluate the usefulness question. So the evaluate usefulness question asks you to make a judgment or a decision about how useful a source is for finding out about a particular issue. There are two evaluate the usefulness questions in the final exam, and each one is worth 5 marks. One of the questions will be a primary source and the other one will be a secondary source, which is very good because there are set ways to answer this question, and if you remember the set ways to answer it, there's a couple of marks that you can basically know by heart before you go into the exam. So, when answering the evaluate the usefulness question, I think it's easy to just remember them by the acronym TACO. So we start off with time, which is just whether it's a primary or secondary source, then author, which is who wrote it, then content, what does the source actually say, and omissions, which just means things that aren't missed out, which is what does the source not tell us. The key thing to remember when answering evaluate the usefulness questions is that each and every point you make must include the word useful in some form. So you must say that the source is either useful or less useful and then give a reason. If you don't use the word useful, then you are not evaluating the usefulness according to the marking instructions and you cannot gain a mark. So please make sure that when you're answering these questions, you use the word useful and look back once you've finished those questions to make sure you've written the word useful 5 times, because if you've not written it at least 5 times, then you will not get 5 marks. So first thing for the evaluate this question, as I say, is time. And so we'll look at the primary source one first. So to gain a mark for a primary source time mark, you must say that the source is a primary source, you must state the date that it was written, and you must use the word useful and say that it was useful because it was written at the time of the events that are relevant to the question. Now, you can't just say it was written at the time of the events. You have to be specific and clearly state which events you're talking about. So, for example, source is useful was a primary source written in 1806. This makes useful was written at the time of the slave trade. So you have to mention the specific events. Now, that's easy to do if you just look at what the question is asking you. If it's asking you about the events of the slave trade or events of the Middle Passage or conditions in the trenches or the events at Little Rock or something like that, just say it was useful because it was written at the time of the Little Rock protest or during World War One or during the time of the Middle Passage. Those kind of things. You have to be specific. If you've just written the time of the events, you won't gain the mark. So for a secondary source, you must, for a time mark, say that it's a secondary source, state the date that it was written, and say it was useful because it was written with the benefit of hindsight. Now, you just have to use that exact phrase, benefit of hindsight. That's the phrase that is in the marking instructions for these types of questions. Now, hindsight just means that you're able to look back on something and make a kind of overall judgment about it. So you can look back in hindsight if you've done well. After you've, in an exam, you look back in hindsight and say the reason that I did well is because I studied hard, or the reason I didn't do well is because I didn't study hard. So hindsight is about the ability to look back and make a judgment. So obviously, when we're working as historians, if you're a long time after the events, then you can say that you can look back with hindsight, you can kind of make an overall judgment about them. So you would get a mark that way by saying source B is useful as a secondary source written in 2017. This makes it useful, it was written with the benefit of hindsight. So as long as you remember that phrase and use the word useful, then you're guaranteed to get a mark for the secondary source. So for author, to gain the author mark, you must just state who the author was and explain why this makes the source more or less useful. So if it's a modern historian, you state that they are useful because they have expert knowledge or they've studied a range of relevant sources. So source A was written by a modern historian. This is useful because they would have studied a range of relevant sources. Nice and straightforward. If it is a primary source, so someone that was present during the event, you should say that he, she would have been an eyewitness or he, she had first-hand experience of the events. So source B was written by Alda Equano. This is useful as he was an eyewitness to the treatment of slaves on plantations. Excuse me. So when we move on to content, when you're making a content point, you've got to follow what's called the rule of 3. So you have to first quote from the source. Second, make a judgment, is it more or less useful? And for almost all content points, they will be more useful. And then give a reason for your judgment. And the reason should just be that you know this information is accurate or I know this is true from my own knowledge. And you can get 2 content marks, so do this twice. So for example, source A says, the slaves were afraid to approach their masters. This makes the source useful as I know this information is accurate. Or source B says, Slave trade brought jobs to Liverpool. This makes the source useful, as I know this is true from my own knowledge. And then finally, omission. To gain an omission mark, that's, as we've said before, omission just means things that are missing or not included. First of all, you must start by saying the source is less useful, as it fails to mention, and then mention a fact that is not in the source, but is relevant to the question, so it must answer the question. And again, with omission marks, you can get 2 of them, so if you do this twice, you'll gain 2 marks. So examples for omission. The source is less useful as it fails to mention that slaves on the Middle Passage were often forced to dance for exercise. Or the source is less useful as it fails to mention that many Africans were forced to become slaves because of debts. So, evaluate the usefulness questions are all about making judgments about whether information relating to the source makes it more or less useful. So, you can see here there is a question that's about the consequences of slave trade in Britain. It's from a book written by a modern historian, and it says slavery was key to British economic success in the 18th century. As well as providing huge profits for those willing to risk their money in funding a voyage across the Atlantic, the trade also brought other advantages. The need for ships and supplies created huge employment opportunities in the port cities. Secondary businesses, such as insurance companies, were created to meet the needs of the businessmen who financed the trade. However, not everyone connected to the trade was successful. Many businesses collapsed due to greed, bad luck, or simple incompetence. So this is asking us to evaluate the usefulness of source A for investigating the positive consequences of the slave trade in Britain. And for these questions, you've got a little guide. It says you may want to comment on who wrote it, when they wrote it, why they wrote it, what they say, or what has been missed out. So I've written a model answer for you. So we'll start off with the time mark. Source A is a secondary source written in 2016. This makes it useful, making sure we use the word useful, as it was written with the benefit of hindsight. Source B was written by a modern historian. This makes it useful, again the keyword useful, as they would have expertise and would have researched the issue. Source B says, the need for ships and supplies created huge employment opportunities in the port cities. This is useful, again, word useful, because I know it's true from my own knowledge. Source B says, secondary businesses such as insurance companies were created to meet the needs of the businessmen who financed the trade. Again, this is useful, keyword useful, as I know it's true from my own knowledge. Finally, our omission points. Source B is less useful as it fails to mention that many new buildings were built in British cities with money from the slave trade, creating new jobs and improving the look of each place. And our final omission point, source B is less useful as it also fails to mention that profits from the slave trade were invested in new industries such as railways, which contributed to Britain's economic development. So you can see there, started off with a time point, then an author point, then 2 content points and 2 omission points. You can see that's obviously 6 marks. You only need to do 5. Sometimes it's a good idea to do 6 just to make sure you get the marks, but if you feel that you're short on time or you think that you've done it perfectly, then you do not need to. You only need 5 marks in order to gain the marks for that question. Let me just stress again that making judgments is key to these questions, so you have to include the word useful. You have to explain why the quotes that you bring in are useful, and you have to make sure that you're not just saying at the time of events for the time point. Apart from that, these questions are relatively straightforward. Once you get your head around exactly what you need to do, it's quite easy to remember it, and if you remember it, then you can guarantee that you're going to get some marks in the exam. As always, any questions, just let me know.